The history of North America during the colonial period involved many European nations jumping the gun and claiming large swaths of land that they didn't usually control. The lands were so vast that they couldn't occupy all of it at once. Then, of course, in most of these claims there were dozens, if not hundreds, of indigenous American groups who were already there. The Europeans may have had plans to settle these lands that they claimed, but they were desperate to call dibs on the lands they wanted first, so that at least they wouldn't have to also fight another colonial power. Not that it stopped that from happening anyway. French Louisiana, for example, was ginormous, and aside from the New Orleans area and a few spread out forts, the French hardly occupied any of it. But then what made the French decide this weirdly specific border? Well, this was the Mississippi River watershed. A lot of these claims were based off of broad geographical terms like that, and since North America, at least for the Europeans, was largely unexplored in the beginning, that meant there was a lot of overlap and they didn't even know it. In a previous video from a few years back, I used Virginia as an example. A royal charter gave two straight line borders for it that extended, quote, from sea to sea, which meant Virginia was technically supposed to be this big. Half of the other English 13 colonies had something like this, so once the United States formed, there was a short period of time where the states had to settle these disputes with each other, usually just giving them up since they were so far out west. However, in this video I'm going to talk about perhaps the weirdest claim by far. South Carolina had its own western claim, but unlike the others, it technically didn't exist? In 1663, a royal charter was drafted under the authority of English King Charles II to establish the colony of Carolina. Its lands went from sea to sea, just like Virginia, but its northern border overlapped the land set for Virginia. However, since both were approved by the king, this meant the more recent charter was valid. After all, the king's word is law, so the lands and claims were granted to Carolina without dispute from Virginia. Then in 1665, the border was pushed north again slightly, this time effectively establishing Virginia's current southern border. In the early 1700s, the Carolinas separated into north and south, the colonial divorce being finalized in 1729. The border starts off the same as the current border until around the Savannah River, when it continues as a straight line, still in theory to the Pacific Ocean, but this border would become an issue just a few years later in 1732, when the 13th and final colony of Georgia was established. Just like before, this royal charter was going to take land away from the previous charter from Carolina, but the initial borders were strange. From the charter, Georgia was given all those lands, countries, and territories situated, lying and being in that part of South Carolina in America, which lies from the most northern part of a stream or river there, commonly called the Savannah, all along the seacoast to the southward, onto the most southern stream of a certain other great water or river called the Altamaha, and westerly from the heads of the said rivers, respectively in the direct line to the South Seas. Firstly, wow, what a run-on sentence with way more commas than is necessary, but that aside, this granted Georgia essentially these lands, which technically meant all of this was still South Carolina in theory, but disputed by the indigenous Americans and also Spain. That part mattered less, and eventually would be viewed as Georgian in 1763 anyway. But South Carolina was concerned with the northern border. The headwaters of the Savannah River were considered the starting point of Georgia's northern boundary. South Carolina was legally left with all the land between the headwaters of the Savannah and the border of North Carolina, so that part everyone agreed on. The dispute was, where did the Savannah start? When locating the headwaters or source of a river, the usual practice is to measure the main river from the coast, then as far as the longest tributary or branch river. That's why sometimes you see the Mississippi River listed as the Mississippi-Missouri River, since the Missouri River is the longest branch. The main Savannah River was obvious, but no one had officially confirmed for sure which branch was the longest and therefore the true source of the river. From South Carolina's point of view, the Tougaloo River was the proper source. This would mean a 12-mile wide strip in theory to the Pacific Ocean, but by this point really to just the Mississippi River, would still be theirs. From Georgia's perspective though, they thought that the Kiowa River was the end of the Savannah River, which ended in North Carolina, meaning South Carolina would have no western territory at all, and that Georgia would be claiming a part of North Carolina as well. As it turns out, they were actually both kind of wrong. We now know that the Tougaloo River was the right direction, but it also continued into the Chattooga River, which also ended inside North Carolina. So, by the wording of the laws, the land South Carolina was claiming technically didn't even exist. However, since back then they didn't know that and the answer was less clear, South Carolina still asserted this claim. But in 1787, just 4 years after American independence was confirmed by the Treaty of Paris, South Carolina decided to give it up. They agreed to cede it to the federal government, which meant now the government was administering land that technically didn't exist. South Carolina also established its modern-day border with Georgia that same year, with Georgia giving up its claims to the Kiowa River. However, Georgia continued to claim everything to the Mississippi River and continued to claim the tiny parts of North Carolina, including the areas that would later become the state of Tennessee. But then in 1794, the Georgia governor George Matthews conducted real estate fraud, selling those western lands to political insiders for cheap prices. This scandal became known as the Yazoo Land Scandal, and trying to undo the damage over the next few years was a complicated mess. Eventually in 1802, Georgia agreed to cede its western claims to the federal government, who would spend the next decade trying to fix the real estate mess caused by the scandal. So now Georgia has its modern western border. But with that cession, the government also agreed to hand over to Georgia the original South Carolina claim east of those lands. So in theory, this meant that the land was finally resolved, but since that bit of land never existed, it had realistically been resolved years ago. Although Georgia would still claim a bit of North Carolina until 1818. So much legal headache over such a simple geographic mistake. But I find it fascinating. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time. Happy 2026, everyone. I made a new channel census survey sort of thing where I ask questions about what you guys enjoy watching on my channel and what type of videos you want me to make more of throughout the year. Every response matters, and I'd appreciate it if you filled it out. It really helps the channel. Results will be live streamed near the end of the month. Thanks again.